Hi, I'm Ghost. I'm your host, and today we're talking about this delightful plate of meatballs. Okay, unfortunately that was a lie. I know that the science of meatballs is a rather interesting topic, but unfortunately we're talking about horror, how it devalues death, and how horror movies lose their impact in the process, and how horror movies can gain back their impact. Now here's the thing. Horror movies don't need death in order to be impactful. In fact, often death is one of the, generally speaking, less impactful parts of a horror movie nowadays, especially if you're a horror fan, because quite plainly, it's been done so much. While it's always nice to have a nice tropey slasher, when every movie follows so many similar concepts, it ends up just losing a large portion of its impact. Oh well, the blonde's gotta die first, or whatever, you know? And there's either a final girl or no survivors, and you can usually gauge that based off of the first 10 minutes of the movie. See, no horror movie is shocking anymore, and while I could go on about how I believe that horror movies have softened themselves and gone for a more mainstream approach, that's an entirely separate topic. What I'm simply saying is that horror movies, while still innovative, aren't innovating enough to actually be shocking and surprising. Everything feels like it's been done before. We're kind of in this weird area of horror where, while a lot of movies aren't, technically speaking, bad, they just don't feel like anything of substance. It's rare for me to find a movie, and I watch a lot of horror movies. It's very rare for me to find a movie that actually has any real power to me. I think that one of the rare examples of this would be The Wailing. The Wailing is a South Korean horror film that is rather remarkable in its unorthodox way of telling its story. It's powerful, it's peculiar, and it doesn't simply rely on killings in order to get its impact. It feels like you're in a great, rapid downward spiral the entire movie. And eventually, there's a point where you do see a rather gruesome scene involving death toward the end of the film that definitely feels impactful because the movie hasn't been focused on a non-stop series of killings. The less killings there are, the more impactful each kill will be. Now, it feels like this should be a given, right? But quite plainly, there are a lot of movies that don't seem to understand this, or feel as though they do, but then proceed to skimp out on kills as much as possible. Take Pearl, for example, where while there aren't that many kills, each kill is so bland and unoriginal that they really don't feel impactful whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that having a lot of kills can't be a strength. Look at the Terrifier franchise. I believe that, they revel in their kills and how over-the-top and insane they can be. And they're fun, but quite plainly, Terrifier shocks a mainstream audience. To horror veterans, while Terrifier definitely is pushing a boundary that hasn't really been pushed in a long time, to horror veterans, it's less shocking and more so just a fun love letter to old grindhouse classics. Horror movies have progressively devalued death more and more, to the point where it's become such a commonplace in horror films to just have a non-stop slaying or have a rather weak occasional slaying that horror movies have largely lost their impact. But what about the horror movies that don't rely on kills whatsoever? The psychological horror genre. Now, psychological horror, I believe, has also grown stale to a certain degree. Let me explain. The idea of old psychological horror was essentially to creep into your head and really fuck with you. Nowadays, it feels like people haven't been doing that so successfully, and more so just been like, what if we psychologically toy with the characters? The strength of psychological horror is when you're fucking with the audience. A good mindfuck horror film is very, very memorable. Hell, a good mindfuck in general, even take out the horror part of the equation. Just look at so many of these movies. Look at Cat Soup, for God's sake. It leaves a lasting impact on you, without relying on a non-stop series of violence. Psychological horror is growing stale because it's more focused on the psychological torment of characters, and not the audience. Now, of course, there's a line you have to stay on, because you can very easily go to the point where the psychological horror film attacks this audience so heavily that it's simply not a pleasant watch. And there's also the point where, if you fall the other way, it just is, torturing the characters and not at all the audience. But I believe that it's important to find a good balance. I'd like to briefly move our view to a film I've actually previously talked about, a full series in which I also interviewed the creator, the August Underground films. Now, the August Underground films is one of the few in which a non-stop onslaught of vicious violence and killings is actually quite effective. The reason it's effective, however, is something that most horror movies cannot pull off, which is how aggressively realistic it is. The purpose of the August Underground film trilogy is to essentially depict serial killers in the most honest and unforgiving light that they can possibly be portrayed in. Which is where August Underground holds its power. Because with something like, say, Halloween or Friday the 13th or Terrifier, you can go to any of those slasher type films. It feels removed enough from reality that they have to find other ways to gain impact. With August Underground, it is so grounded in reality that it is a just deeply depressing and powerful experience. So essentially, the question is, how can a horror movie remain impactful? I mean, there are so many ways to lose that. How can it be impactful? One, if you lessen the amount of kills, again, this is largely applicable to slashers, but less kills, but make sure that the kills are memorable and powerful. Don't rely on kills and psychologically torment the viewers, or ground yourself in reality to a point that it feels essentially like a depressing watch, more so than a downright horrifying one. I hope I've at least stirred up some thought, even if you do not agree with me. I certainly don't believe that I'm necessarily in the majority in my way of thinking in this regard, but I felt like it was worth discussing. So I hope you've enjoyed my video. I hope to see you again in the future, and best wishes.